knowing God has a hand in it to further the gospel. Just brought to mind Romans 8:28. All things work together for the good, called according to his purpose. And no wonder he could write that to the Romans, because he learned it. So God used Paul's imprisonment to open the door to the very heart of Rome, the imperial palace, with the message of Christ. We need to keep in mind that when bad things happen to us, sometimes they can have a divine purpose. They don't always have a divine purpose. We live in a fallen world, and sometimes bad things just happen. But sometimes God will use, it's not that God sends bad things into our lives. The word says he gives good gifts to his children. But in Paul's situation, he came to see this imprisonment as a good gift because he could spread the gospel. And his whole focus is on spreading the gospel. But God can use the bad circumstances in our lives for a divine purpose, to reach other people or to grow us, or a myriad of things. So we need to keep that in mind, and that will encourage us. You know, it helps me to think that, and I believe this is true, that no suffering is wasted. God uses it. And sometimes in our suffering, I'm not talking mine specifically, but individual suffering, God uses it to speak to the hearts of even his children. You know, I can't tell you how many people I've heard come up to Becca and tell her, it encourages them to see how she just keeps soldiering on. You know, so even though I don't think God sends her suffering, God uses it as a testimony to other people. Verse 14, and many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Our response to negative situations in our lives really can serve as an encouragement to others. Well, if she can do it, then maybe I can do it. Paul's faith was infectious. When you're around somebody who has a really strong faith and tries to see the good in everything, doesn't it encourage you to do the same? It's just like if you're around a really negative person who sees nothing but bad, doesn't it bring you down? I don't like to be around negativity. You know, I want to think good thoughts. The word tells us to think on the good things of life. But his word circulated that Paul's even having an impact in Rome as a prisoner in spreading the gospel. Then the people in the church, the brethren, their discouragement at the fact that he was arrested gave way to courage, seeing that Paul didn't shrink back in the face of hostility. So we need to do more to spread the gospel. Verse 15, some indeed preach Christ, even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. So Paul acknowledged here two distinct groups of preachers, and they still exist. It has to do with human beings. But the one, he says, first group, preaching with wrong motives. He said they didn't preach sincerely. They preached Christ, even of envy and strife. They preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to his bonds, to hurt him, to discourage him. And a lot of 3 different sources I checked yesterday all agreed that these are probably Judaizers in the church who wanted people to become Jews in order to become Christian, essentially, to follow the law in all those aspects. I read one of the law. Like, it's more important to understand the grace of God than to try to keep the law, because Jesus fulfilled the law. But the Judaizers, their whole focus was on the law and the keeping of the law. So that made sense to me. Seems they tried to cultivate their own personal following and preach from a contentious spirit. Do you ever sit under the preaching of someone, every sermon it felt like you would never measure up, you would never be good enough? It was discouraging. And that's what comes to mind to me when I hear a contentious spirit. Always, like, they're always upset about something. And they assumed it would hurt Paul when he heard that people were shifting loyalty from the gospel of grace that he's been preaching to whatever these guys are preaching. On the other hand, the second group, some people rose up to the challenge and filled in the gap that was created by Paul's absence. They're continuing to preach the message Paul preached, and going by his example of sacrificial and courageous ministry for Christ. The fact, this is evidence, that the fact that someone is preaching doesn't mean that his or her motives are pure. We have to keep that in mind. They're human beings. And there are many wolves in sheep's clothing in pulpits around the country who line their own pockets on the other gospel that they preach. And I know I'm talking about the prosperity gospel. You do what I tell you. You sow into my ministry, and God's going to give you. God's going to give you a house with a white picket fence and 2.5 children, and all that. So we have to be wise when we hear the preaching of the word. And God will never send a message that doesn't agree with his word. But that's the thing. False teachers and preachers use the word of God, but twist it just a bit. And that's why it's so important that we be in the word and know what the word says. So when we hear something that doesn't align with the word, we'll know, wait, I need to go back and look at that, because that doesn't sound quite right to me. There's an element of truth in every doctrine, or nobody would ever buy it. But like I said before, there's a big difference in knowing information so that you can do well on a fill-in-the-blank test than just kind of knowing it and being able to take a multiple-choice test. And as believers in this day we live in, we need to know the word well enough to do a fill-in-the-blank test, so that when we hear something that doesn't feel right, we know where to go and look for it, and let the Spirit speak to us about what the intention was. But Paul said in other places, they preach another gospel, not the one Christ gave me to preach to you. They changed it. So we need to be aware of that. Verse 18, what then? Notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, talking about these two different kinds of preachers, Christ is preached, and I therefore do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. So Paul's saying, if they're preaching out of spite to hurt me, if they're taking advantage of the situation that I'm not there to continue to spread their false doctrine, in spite of all of that, Christ is still being preached. So he was rejoicing in that, even if their motives are wrong. What a man of God to be able to see it from that perspective. We had a preacher friend who had a lot of people saved under his ministry, and then it came out that he had been having an affair for a long time and still preaching. And so Sherman and I talked a lot about that, and I wrestled with how could those people have been saved under his preaching when he was living an ungodly life? And what God finally revealed to me is because the power is in his word, not in the vessel that's delivering it. So the word still went forth and bore fruit, even if the vessel that was delivering it was not where he should have been at the two-edged sword. So he was preaching the word even if he wasn't living a righteous life. And that's what Paul's saying here. Even if their motives are wrong, the word is still going out. People are still hearing it. The gospel's still being preached. Paul believed in the power of the gospel itself. 1 Corinthians 1:17 and 18.
For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of human wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its powers. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God, for it is written.
That's okay. A quote out of my lesson book said, "Some overestimate the importance of the human vessel in evangelism or in preaching the gospel." There are many people with what we call charisma. You know, they have a good delivery. Which of our kids played soccer with David Carrico's son, Brian? David Carrico was pastor at Clarksburg Baptist at the time, and he coached the soccer team. And a lady came up to him that was on the team after practice one day and said, "I was in your service Sunday." He said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you." And she said, "Well, I made sure that I was anonymous in the back, and I slipped out as soon as you finished." But she said, "I thought about it all week, and I want to tell you, you have a wonderful delivery." And he said, "Well, thank you, but did you hear anything